to be sensitive usually to that. You see. So we have thinking and thought. Now, then besides that, we have feeling or motion, whatever you want to call it. Now, feeling is a very active, has the word ing at the end of it, the suffix, and that suggests something that's always active, right? And primary and real. But it's not true. You see, unfortunately, the English language is deficient in this regard. It has introduced the distinction of thinking and thought, but it has not made a corresponding distinction among feelings. I will do it for the moment now. I say there are feelings and felts. I mean, feelings you've had in the past have gone on the memory and become programs. You can remember feelings you've had, right? Feelings of traumatic events, feelings of pleasure, nostalgia, right? And all that stuff, right? And that has a powerful effect, right? You find it hard to distinguish some from genuine feeling. Let's say you get a genuine feeling of relationship, or in the jungle somebody might have got a feeling of danger, and then he's got to think, what does it mean? And let's say he sees a snake, what does it mean? He says, it's not a poisonous snake, it goes away, right? It is a poisonous snake, you'd better move, right? And so on. So there's a natural relation of feeling and thinking, that a feeling sort of picks up the perception first, and then the question arises, what does it mean? And thinking begins to supply that, right? Now, if it's working right, then thinking will show whether the feeling is appropriate or not. But it may not work right, you see. Now, we can get felts, right? Now, there's no easy way to deal with those. You see, if you had a lot of traumatic experience as a child with certain things, you get a felt every time something similar comes up, and you can't deal with it. You see, it's in the memory. You see, the natural intelligence might reach the feeling, but how is it going to reach the memory, the program? It doesn't know there's one there and doesn't know where it is, right? So you don't change it. You see, you're stuck with it, you see. So the point is that failure to understand that is a crucial difficulty in the whole process of thought. You see, in other words, what thought thinks about itself is very important, because it conditions and programs itself in a wrong way. So the way in which thought programs itself to go wrong is the thing we have to look at. Now, it has programmed itself to go wrong as a result of a long history. Right? So we have the thinking and feeling, thinking and thought, feeling and felt, right? And the question is, how are we going to get at it? You see, I say that it's something very subtle. I think there are one or two more points. We're just happy the evening. We don't want to go on too long. You see, there are things which are obvious and things which are subtle. Now, the word subtle means, highly refined, rarefied, elusive, delicate, undefinable. So I can't define subtle since it means undefinable. But its root is interesting, subtext, which means finely woven. In other words, you could say the mind makes more and more finely woven nets in which it could catch subtler and subtler things, right? Ordinary thought is not very subtle. Its net is very coarse, and a lot of things slip right through. Some of the questions we've been discussing slip right through. You see. So now what do we mean by subtlety? You will not be able to sense anything subtle without sensitivity, right? It's elusive, undefinable, delicate. You see, that calls for sensitivity. As I said, the society doesn't want too much sensitivity. You see, I'll give you an example. We knew there was some girl who was going to school, and she got this teacher was doing all sorts of incoherent things, I would call it, this crazy thing. She said this. It all doesn't make any sense, She was very disturbed, right? So the mother finally said, in this house, the teacher is always right. You see, it didn't mean she believed the teacher was right. She said, there's no point in your raising these issues. You're wasting your energy. But it illustrates the point that the whole society finally teaches the child that it's no point in being sensitive to all that incoherence, because you get nowhere. Therefore, that child learns a more general lesson, not merely this and that incoherence, but all incoherence, right? Saying, don't notice these things, right? Don't pay too much attention. Don't take them too seriously, because you'll get in trouble and you'll get nowhere, right? And you see, now, therefore, the society, in order to stabilize itself, systematically, not this society only, almost all that we know of over history, have systematically destroyed sensitivity, which is necessary for intelligence, right? For settled intelligence. You see, thought, the kind of thought we've been talking about is not very subtle. You see, it's pretty crude and gross. And we need subtlety, and we need sensitivity. You see, now, does everybody, but you see, can we have a formula for becoming sensitive? What would you say?
A whole way of life.
What?
Has to be a whole way of life.
It's part of, it's your whole life is involved, not just this or that, right?
Not to be brutalized to begin with.
Yeah, but if you are, what are you going to do? You see, most of us are, you see, so we've got to change, you see. At least maybe we can, right? If we assume that we can't, then that finishes it, right? See, thought is very powerful. By saying this is impossible, that blocks it. So it's a wrong tactic or a wrong strategy to start with the assumption that what we want to do is impossible. It doesn't prove that it is possible, but at least we have to leave it open.
Talk a little bit more, please, about what you mean by sensitivity.
Yes, it's hard to explain, but suppose we take the case of this girl who the teacher is doing all sorts of things that don't make sense, right? So they're sort of disturbing her, right? Now, what's happening? How is she feeling? You know, there's some feelings that come up when something happens that doesn't make sense. Now, I don't know what. You see, suppose you're coming into a room and you say, "There's something wrong in this room." I can't say exactly what. You sense it. Then you begin to ask, what could it be and what does it mean and so on. Maybe then you find it.
I would suggest that you wouldn't do that, that you would sense the feeling that you have and not have to put it into content, because as soon as you put it into content, it's locked, and that's where we get caught in thought, or we get caught in the content, and we don't have any space behind it to see that we are just, that becomes the reality, which obviously cannot be. There's an interpretation.
But sometimes we must. You see, for example, if you're, say you have a machine and it's not quite working, you know, you sense something is wrong here or here, it doesn't look quite right, or you have a problem in mathematics, you see, you sense there's a contradiction somewhere and you can't tell where. You see, there are times when you want to find out what it is, right? Now, there may be other times when it's not necessary.
Well, in your suggestion then, what you're doing is you're actually playing with it. You're not coming to a conclusion.
No.
When you find a machine that isn't working, you have to look at it. You have to take it apart. So you actually are working back and forth with that feeling and then with thought.
Yeah.
If you come into a room and you say, gee, I feel something funny here, I bet it's because, and then I'm finished.
Oh, no,
and
don't do that, no.
See, that's where the difference between the sensitivity comes in. You don't come to a conclusion or don't have a content. You play with it. You just let it ride.
Go ahead. Yes, don't come to a conclusion. The idea is you hold back for a little while. You see, it's necessary to suspend the action.
Yes.
And we'll come to that later. This suspension is crucial to sensitivity. You say, I don't decide, I don't say this or that, but I'm looking and I'm trying to find out, right?
And thought will come up,
Yeah.
or thinking will be happening, and that can be perhaps trusted or not, but you keep that open.
Oh, yeah.
And you let the next thing come along and see if that validates what the thought that came up, and it's a whole process like that.
Yeah, so thought can work together with sensitivity, you see. So see, that begins to show thought isn't always the villain, you see. You see, it has gone wrong, badly wrong in the whole of history, but it needn't be the villain, you see. Now, and we need this sensitivity, which is the beginning of something beyond thought, right? In other words, thought and what is beyond thought don't necessarily just stand on two sides of the fence, you know, saying here's the fence, since thought is here and non-thought is over there. But you see, they sort of meet, right? So it may be that by following this, we will get beyond thought. You see, you know, in some fundamental way. So our minds are open, right? We don't know. You see, we have to start Don't say, I'm going to tell you I know and you don't know, and I'm going to tell you. And when you come out of here, you'll know too.
Sensitivity is other than thought?
It's not other, it's beyond, it's a bit beyond the thought as a program, right? The word thought means the program, basically. Now, but when sensitivity enters, then thought itself begins to have new possibilities, right?
It's usually thought that destroys sensitivity.
Well, a certain kind of thought, right? That thought which is trying to defend something very precious. You know, saying, this must not be touched, right? That kind of thought.
Like, say you walk in a room, you get a feeling something's wrong, and you say, oh, that's just my imagination, then you've immediately used
Yeah,
thought
well, you may not
stop.
want to be bothered, you see. You say, we've too much trouble to go into all this, and you see, there are all sorts of reasons which thought could give you why you shouldn't be sensitive, right? On the other hand, you could not be too sensitive. Thought can make you sensitive in a wrong way by making you very touchy, you see. So it's a very subtle question. See, this comes back to the fact that we have got to get into something subtle, which requires another level of sensitivity again, right? You see.
Sensitivity, a potential faculty that has the quality of freshness and not the kind of the frozen of the thought, programming thought. It's sensitivity is something present, fresh, spontaneous, awakened. That's maybe the distinction with the programmed thought. Of course, sensitivity is using the relative thought, but it seems to me at the moment that it has a freshness. It's something that springs out and has an aliveness.
Yes, it's much more alive. It's tentative. It's it's undefined. You see, it's subtle. You see, it's like the word subtle means finally undefinable, but elusive, delicate. You see, all those words could be applied to sensitivity.
But does it keep all the senses alert?
Yes, and that's a good point. That I would say that we ordinarily think of the senses as one thing and sensitivity as another, but I would say without sensitivity, the senses cannot give you much information of value, you see. You will merely pick up what you're used to, you see, and therefore you could now say the senses are an extension of sensitivity in certain directions, but the fundamental quality is sensitivity, right? Which may be in the mind as well as in the senses.
Could you say it's a kind of looking before you leap?
Well, that's sometimes it is, but primarily it's a kind of, being open to, you see, I think it's natural, but it's being destroyed by thought which says you shouldn't be sensitive, right? But you should be well determined for certain purposes, right?
Could it be that the sensitivity is related more to the perception, which is devoid of the memory bank of thought? And once thought acts on that perception, it alters.
Yes, well, sensitivity is the first step toward perception. It's the beginning of picking up new information, you see, which is not in the categories of thought, right? But at the same time, it's sensitive to thought too, right? Now, see, I'll just finish on this one point, then we won't go into it thoroughly. In a way, what destroys sensitivity is what I would call a generalized idea of violence, you see. I'll just say a few things about violence now, and I think you can see that it brings it all together. Perhaps we'll come back to it in the next periods. But you see, the word violent, according to the dictionary, means the undue use of force. In other words, it doesn't mean you should never use force to push something around, but in the wrong place, right? And it also is related to the word violate. You're violating the right order, you see, and so on. Now, now, the point is, the basic form of violence is that his action is determined by thought, right? Now, however bad it is, it's determined by some kind of thought. But at some stage, we respond with force, right? We respond to thought with force, right? As if we could obliterate it or push it aside or change it or something, right? Now that force may be more subtle, it may be just mental force rather than physical force, right? But it does not meet the thought itself, right? Its content. You see what I mean? That now, so that, for example, somebody is doing something that frustrates you very much. It blocks what you want to do, and you say, you make a picture of him as that person who's always doing that, right? And you say he needs to be pushed aside or hit, or something should be said to him sharp, or you can also produce violence as an undue use of mental force. See, the word convince means to win. It's a kind. The word persuade is based on suave and sweet. It means to win by sweet talk, but that is also a form of violence, right? It does not meet the actual issue. See, persuasion and conviction can be regarded as subtle forms of violence, right? Now, really, ultimately, what's called for is simply these thoughts must meet, and we must see whether they're coherent or not, and what their value is, right? So, if you don't like what the other side is doing, say the communist or capitalist or religion, you form the image of them as wicked, and you say, they're always that way, they only understand force, right? That's a typical thing you say. Which, of course, nobody understands force. So it will create the sense that if somebody responds to you with force, when you will feel that you have been violently treated too, you see, right? If they don't listen to you. If people don't listen, you'll feel that's a form of violence, right? And then you get into a complex problem, because you may see somebody else's violence and you say it's his violence, right? But it's really yours as well, you see, because you cannot see his violence except in terms of your own. You see your own tendency to use force, undue force, right? Inwardly or outwardly or somewhere, you see. So suppose you're watching a television program with a violent content. There's nothing going on there at all except spots of light, but you can feel the violence in the program, right? But where is it coming from? It's coming from your own violence, right? You see, each person has been programmed to violence over the ages, and everybody's got plenty of violent programs in it. There's no difficulty in finding a violent program to project into the image or to project into the image of somebody else, right? And therefore, the point is that, first of all, if you see violence, you see it through your own, but then you don't want to admit, you want to say that's terrible, it's disturbing, so you then say deny that it's mine and say it's that person's, right? And you feel better, but the violent movement is still in there, right? Which will come out in another way and distorting your thought, right? See, so therefore, and we also have a thought which says that I am justified in responding to violence with violence, right? I respond to good to friendship with friendship, and to violence with violence. That's an accepted thought, but that thought cannot actually work overall in the long run. It must be sure destruction. It destroys all sides, you see, because once you respond with violence, you're turning your own system into chaos. You see, and everything you do goes wrong. Now has no meaning. So the thing is then that this is a very subtle point, right? It requires a lot of sensitivity to see it. But of course, violence is constantly destroying that sensitivity. You see, your violent reaction is smashing you up inside, so you're not sensitive, right? You're not only not sensitive to that, you're not sensitive to almost anything else, and you do all sorts of things wrong. You see, so so you could see this, that one of the basic difficulties with thought is violence. You see, the other side of violence is fear. You see, when you think you've got a lot of force, you don't hesitate to be violent, to use force to overcome. But when you don't think you have that force, then you're afraid, right? You try to retreat. And the point is that that fear and violence are closely connected, because you can then project your own violence into the other person, and you're afraid of it, right? So therefore, the two go together, right? They're just two sides of that one process. And you could see physically violence is a tremendous problem, but mentally it's a much more serious problem. You see, you can see violence in the way people insist on their view and simply dismiss anything else, right? That will provoke violence. You see, I saw a program about, there's the Northern and Southern Irish, and we know all the violence going on there, but there was an election in Southern Ireland as to whether they should have a very limited form of divorce, and that was rejected totally. Now, you could see they showed talking with people, there was that absolute conviction, that it simply dismissed any other point of view. Now, and this fellow pointed out that that was a tremendous blow against the unity with the North that they wanted, you see. That the minute the Protestants in the North would see that, they would say, well, but we could never unite with them. They simply dismiss anything. Even on this little issue, they won't move, right? You see, so the violence in thought is the root of, fundamentally, of all that violence with guns, right? You see, so I want to say that thought, which does not understand what it is doing, tends to fall into violence. Right? Now, in the primitive times, this happened much less frequently. People were further apart, living in small groups, and it didn't matter so much because the weapons they had were not so dangerous anyway. Now, we have very dangerous weapons, and at the same time, if we're violent, we're going to not be able to get together to meet this ecological crisis and all sorts of things we have to do together. So I think it'd be worth looking into, being sensitive to violence, your own violence, other people, in all its forms, because violence is basically the movement which destroys sensitivity. So we could say, if we are insensitive, we have to be sensitive to what is destroying sensitivity. That would be the only way out, right? Now, therefore, we could say that rather than condemning violence or saying I mustn't be violent, or I must be violent, or I justify violence, saying if he treats me violently, then I'm justified, or else I must turn the other cheek, or I must do this or that. You see, none of that gets to the root that thought is the source of violence, right? See, these are all attempts, the typical of thought, to produce a problem and then to produce some means of overcoming the problem that it's constantly producing. You see, that it's like hitting yourself on the head with a hammer with the right hand and trying to stop it with the left, you see. That you continue the thought, the kind of thought that makes violence, and then you say we ought not to be violent, you see. So that just simply muddles it up, right? It's another kind of violence. You see, thought turns violently against itself, right? Violence turns against itself, but remains violence as it does so. Now I think it's worth thinking about that. It's a way of thinking, looking, not really thinking, which and being sensitive, which gives some insight if you pursue it. That you can see that a tremendous amount of the confusion in your own thought is a kind of violence with which thought is attacking those parts of itself that it doesn't like. Now, you're going to say, we're going to have to go into what will you do if you find yourself full of things you don't like in yourself, you see. We have to go into all that. Violence will do no good, right? Now, ignoring it will do no good, right? So we have got to have an approach which, and I think there is an approach which can, get into it. And which means going further into thought and what it, how it goes and so on. Now,
is this violence sort of rooted in the need of thought to feel it's always correct or right?
Well, that's part of its root. That certainly is part of it. Also the need to feel secure, to be sure.
So it has to believe these coarse generalizations.
Yes, it's really one of those nets that is very coarse. You see, with the violent nets are extremely coarse. Not subtle. No.
So speedy, because it labels things quickly.
Yeah, very, very fast emotional reactions, and there was some months ago in the New York Times saying that there are two ways that emotion could be dealt with. See, one way is that the whole system, the brain, including the intellect, can sort of evaluate the emotion and see whether it makes sense or not. But there's another faster way, which is that, which apparently was useful in primitive times, that in situations of danger there can be a very fast turning on of the emotion very powerfully. And memory can do that, you see, say the memory of certain dangers. But then the memory of our whole conditioning does it too, you see. Yeah. Now, so we have to say that adds to violence, right? That's part of the movement of violence.
Could you maybe speak to, or maybe this is my own conclusion, it's not true, but I sense that the physical fear is far less than our psychological fear.
Yes, we could say that there would be reasonable physical fears that wouldn't confuse, they wouldn't disorganize us. You see, in the primitive situation, the fear might get you to run from the animal if you can't handle it, and then when you're finished, when you run away, it stops, right? Or if the animal catches you, then he eats you and it stops too. You see, it doesn't go on forever, right? On the other hand, our present fears about thought go on forever. You see, a person is afraid, will I hold my job? Will the boss, like me? Now that goes on forever, and it starts to degenerate the brain, right? But see, the kind of psychological fear, the physical fear may be a reaction to a perceived danger, but the psychological fear is something much more subtle and complex, you see, which we have to get into.
The development of thought has increased our psychological fear, the development of thought.
Yes, the more thought develops, the more things we have to be afraid of, you see, both in reality and imaginary. You see, because we produced all kinds of dangers, like the nuclear danger, the ecological danger, you see, due to the way we think, and at the same time, there are a tremendous number of, they are real dangers, but produced by confused thinking, by incoherent thinking, right?
Wasn't sensitivity different from the program? Because sensitivity happens in the moment, in the now, and the now is a perception, and it's real. Like fear, it could be a program, because the word fear makes you fearful, and also fear might cause a pain in the body. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the pain now, you see that the pain is different. You think it's fear, but because you're accustomed to having a feeling when the word fear is expressed, and the body always reacts the same way. It reacts to a program. Mm-hmm. But if you look at it in the now, something happens, because the now then, as I understand it, what you said, beyond the brain, the now is beyond the brain, or it's out of time.
Yes, I think that may well be so, but I think that we could get into it in the wrong way, in the sense to, before, you see, that could become another pattern of program, you see. In other words, whatever you say, whether it's true or false or whatever, can go onto the program and become a source of imagination, right? Now, I think we have to be careful to go slowly to see that danger, to see how can we proceed without getting into that situation, and to actually come to into contact with this process of thought in its deceptive movement sufficiently so that we don't fall into that trap. You see, even something which is very true, when just stated, can become a trap, right? If it just goes on the program. See, so I'm saying the first step is not truth, but can we see what's the meaning of what's going on, right? See, if we don't see this meaning clearly, then we'll never have a mind which can get to truth, right? Have truth. That we have to see the meaning of this thought process, which now we have a wrong meaning.
Can we never have truth then? From what you just said, I don't know whether we ever can have truth.
No, we won't have truth, but let's say, are we going to be in truth, you know?
Okay,
Yes, we'll have to discuss this whole question of truth, because I think that's part of the confusion of thought. That thought has very confused the incoherent notions of truth, which go into the program and trap us, you see. Because once you say something is true, this gives it tremendous power. So if the program says this is true, it takes right over, right? Now, that's the surest way to make the program take over, is just to put it down and say that's true, right?
But another problem is that we never can get any consensus on the meaning of any specific meaning.
Well, we'll go into that too. You see, that's where the dialogue comes in, where we will see if we, I don't know if we can do it all in this short period, but to raise the question of whether we can share a meaning. So we have to say both individually, we have to get our meaning clear, coherent, and collectively. Right? Now, this, as I said, this is a rather, to do all this is a rather short period in 2 more days, but we will try to do something, you see. I mean, we'll have to make a selection. We can't cover the whole thing in all detail, right? Right, well, I think then that if unless somebody has an urgent question, I'll call a halt for tonight, and we'll start tomorrow morning at 10, right?
Are we born with a tendency of programming deceiving thought? Are we born with that tendency of the deceiving thought?
Well, I don't know if we're born with the possibility that it may go wrong, you see.
The difference between conditioning and learning, you seem to use those things interchangeably. And the question of whether we're born with it or whether it's something, this process is something we learn.
Well, we have learned it, but it's now part of our culture. So it's transmitted very quickly.
Something about human learning that's picking it up, though, and not just a passive.
Yeah, we've learned something which is destructive, you see. And it has become part of our culture.
We're programming things that we need not program, like if we need to program things like to step back and not step on a rattlesnake. That's a part of programming we need. Or maybe more common than not, step out of the way of a truck coming down the road. We need that kind of programming.
Yeah, the child must be taught that, you see.
But the other kinds of programming.
Well, but then we have to say, how do we draw the line? And see, and we have to go into it. We'll not be able to draw the line intelligently unless we see what is wrong with the other kind. You see, if you merely say that's the bad kind of program, this is the good kind, then that's the same story again, right? You know, do all the good things and keep away from the bad things. That's what they tell you, right? Now, you see, that sort of advice simply muddles it up, right? See, because then what are the good things and what are the bad things? And so there is something specifically incoherent about this way this program works, which we have to get into.
Does thought and thinking end at death?
What?
Does thought and thinking end at death?
Well, I assume it does.
That implies there's another. If thought and thinking end at death, and there is a consciousness or survival of something, consciousness or intelligence, there's an implication that there's another intelligence operating even as we think.
It may well be. You see, I'm not denying it. I'm saying it may be, and maybe we'll come to it. But I think we can't begin with the assumption, you see, because that's, again, the way the program works. Right? If we assume it, then we will create the impression that it's there before when it's not actually working. Right? You see, the assumption is the trap. Huh?
When you mention sensitivity,
yeah,
there's an assumption that there's something other than thinking that's operating, that's bringing us back
You can look at it
experience.
you can look at it as an assumption that is very provisional, that we're going to explore sensitively, you see. In other words, I'm not going to take this as saying this is the truth, right? But I'm saying we all know sensitivity, a little bit about it, right? And it does imply something beyond, we don't know what, right? And if we're sensitive to this assumption, we want to explore this assumption, or call it what you will, it's a proposal rather than an assumption, right? I would rather use the word proposal, right? Explore this proposal sensitively. Do you see what I'm driving at? So it's there to be looked at and explored, right? We cannot say this is the truth, you know, that there really is an intelligence. We really know that there is an intelligence beyond the thought, right? If I began with that, then we would have the wrong beginning, right? Do you see what I mean?
So we're saying, proposing that the ultimate violence and the cause of all the violence in the world is this destruction of our sensitivity.
Yeah, that's the proposal which we have to explore with sensitivity, you see. So in that case, we are going to bring in the very sensitivity that we're going to be learning about, right?
Sensitive about this activity.
Yeah, and about our way of exploring it, right?
We have to tiptoe.
Well, it's a matter of being sort of somewhat, not rushing to conclusions, and also being open to, you see, the sensitivity might include sensitivity of the body. I mean, how does thought affect the feelings in the body? You know, how does it affect the solar plexus and the neck and the stomach? You know, how does it produce tensions in the abdominal walls? And you see, all of these things are part of the meaning of thought, which we must go into, right? See, in other words, sensitivity means we don't restrict it and say, this is thought, that is something else. Right? But one flows into the other, you see. See, thought has produced this whole world, so we have to see that whole process. We're not going to make a sharp boundary between thought and everything else. If you do make that boundary, that blocks sensitivity.
Tendency to put everything in conclusions blocks sensitivity. There's a tendency to put everything in conclusions.
That's right.
It's like that closes all the doors.
Now, can you see that this tendency to put too much into conclusions is a form of violence? Yeah. It is violating the right order, you see. It is trying by some forceful means to close the issue when it's not closed. You see, conclusion means closing it, and there's a place where you can close it, but you're trying to close what cannot be closed, right? And that is violence. You're using force, a kind of very forceful thought, you see.
What you even say when you ask that question, and this was too quick to say yes, would be another violence.
What?
When you said, can you see that that just creates a violence?
Mm-hmm.
And then I just go, yeah. In a sense, that's cut off. That's cutting off. If it's just an answer,
Yeah.
then I stop looking.
No, I'm saying if you have looked and felt that it is a kind of violence, then say yes, then it means it's something. Right? You say, I see that it is a kind of violence, right? Or I have seen, right? You know, that would be the fact, right? See, suppose I say, I hear that question and I... Well,
Yes, that would be so. But then it may tend to stop you from looking.
well, not if you're just saying, I have seen that it's a form of violence, you see, and I can now go further. And I say, what does it mean? You see, what does it imply? Can we go further? And saying, you know, that's a very interesting point, isn't it, that merely making a conclusion can be a form of violence. Maybe there could be other things we accept so readily which are also violent, right?
But what she's saying is that a positive assertion is just as much of a
Violence.
closure as a negative.
It can be, but not every positive assertion is a closure, do you see?
Yes, I just was wondering if that could be seen.
Yeah.
Because I can see my violence and then stop seeing it because I have found...
Oh, yeah, you've settled it, right?
Yes.
No, we're saying it obviously isn't settled. If I say I have seen that my conclusions are a form of violence, And I say, that doesn't settle anything. That means it's the beginning of the inquiry. Because that's a tremendous point, saying, I've been concluding all the time, and so has everybody else, and we all thought we were just doing nice logical thought, right? But it turns out very often we were engaging in subtle violence.
But that means that the thought that was doing the conclusions, all of a sudden can have a glimpse of what it's doing.
Yeah, well, maybe you can even glimpse why you're doing it, you see, but perhaps we should try to go into that a little later. You get a sense of what's making you do it, but that would go further. You see, that's another question, right? See, what makes me engage in such incoherent activity? What is the impulse?
You see sensitivity as a kind of openness, opening kind of process.
Yes, I mean, that's glasnost. That connects to what the fellow who said, whoever said we should discuss what's going on in Eastern Europe.
What about the person that says, oh, I have an open mind, I listen to everything because I don't want to come to closure and there's no conclusions, without discrimination?
Well, that fellow has done it already. You see, he has said that that's what I am. You see, he said that he's defined himself as the one who's always listening to this thing and never coming to a conclusion. Now, clearly, you must sometimes come to a conclusion, right? And he's defined. If you say I never come to a conclusion, you're still violent, right? Because you are violently opposed to coming to conclusions. You see, the point is you're open to coming to conclusions where necessary. You couldn't live without sometimes coming to a conclusion, right? You see, that means subtlety. You see, not just making a sharp boundary like that and saying it's this or that.
A conclusion, isn't it?
What?
Making that statement that I am always open.
Yeah, that's a conclusion, and it's a violent kind of conclusion, right? You see, if you say you've got to be open always, then that's you're enforcing something, right? You're using a kind of moral force, right? You see, because you can use moral force as well as physical force, or force, mental force, force of very powerful expression.
Get carried away, I guess they could say the statement I am is a kind of a conclusion.
Well, maybe it is, you see, but suppose if we feel that way, then we must inquire, you see, and say, is it, what are we doing, right? What does it really mean?
I don't see anything necessarily wrong with coming to a conclusion, relatively speaking. It's just sort of a stepping stone, and then from there you move on. But if you just stop there, that's where it's dangerous.
Well, if you stop permanently,
Yeah.
you see, you may have to stop for a while, you see, or quite a while, right? See, there's no limit to how long. You see, you could conclude that gold has such and such a specific gravity, and we expect to hold that indefinitely, right? But we can see, of course, but that wasn't entirely true because there are isotopes of gold were discovered which have another specific gravity. So it had to change, right? Right, well then perhaps we'll call a halt on and start tomorrow morning.